The Congo Crisis was a period of political upheaval and conflict in the Republic of the Congo between 1960 and 1965. It began almost immediately after the Congo became independent from Belgium and ended, unofficially, with the entire country under the rule of Joseph Désiré Mobutu, constituting a series of civil wars. The Congo Crisis was also a proxy conflict in the Cold War in which the Soviet Union and United States supported opposing factions. Around 100,000 people are believed to have been killed during the crisis. A nationalist movement in the Belgian Congo demanding the end of colonial rule led to the country's independence on 30 June 1960. Minimal preparations had been made and many issues, such as the questions of federalism and ethnicity, remained unresolved. In the first week of July, a mutiny broke out in the army and violence erupted between black and white civilians. Belgium sent troops to protect fleeing whites, and two areas of the country, Katanga and South Kasai, seceded, with Belgian support. Amid continuing unrest and violence, the United Nations deployed peacekeepers, but the UN Secretary-General Dag Hammarskjöld refused to use these troops to help the central government in Leopoldville fight the secessionists. Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba, the charismatic leader of the largest nationalist faction, reacted by calling for assistance from the Soviet Union, which promptly sent military advisors and other support. The involvement of the Soviets split the Congolese government and led to impasse between Lumumba and the president, Joseph Kasavubu. Mobutu, in command of the army, broke this deadlock with a coup d'état, expelled the Soviet advisors and established a new government effectively under his control. Lumumba was placed in captivity and subsequently executed in 1961. A rival government, founded by Antoine Gizenga and Lumumba supporters in the eastern city of Stanleyville, gained Soviet support but was crushed in 1962. Meanwhile, the UN took a more aggressive stance towards the secessionists after Hammarskjöld was killed in a plane crash in late 1961. Supported by UN troops, Leopoldville defeated the secessionist movements in Katanga and South Kasai by the start of 1963. With Katanga and South Kasai back under the government's control, a reconciliatory compromise constitution was adopted and the exiled Katangese leader, Moise Sombe, was recalled to head an interim administration while fresh elections were organized. Before these could be held, however, Maoist-inspired militants calling themselves the Simbas rose up in the east of the country. The Simbas took control of a significant amount of territory and proclaimed a communist People's Republic of the Congo in Stanleyville. Government forces gradually retook territory and, in November 1964, Belgium and the United States intervened militarily in Stanleyville to recover hostages from Simba captivity. The Simbas were defeated and collapsed soon after. Mobutu mounted a second coup d'état in November 1965, now taking personal control. Under Mobutu's rule, the Congo was transformed into a dictatorship which would endure until his deposition in 1997. Background: Belgian rule. Colonial rule in the Congo began in the late 19th century. King Leopold II of Belgium, frustrated by Belgium's lack of international power and prestige, attempted to persuade the Belgian government to support colonial expansion around the then largely unexplored Congo basin. The Belgian government's ambivalence about the idea led Leopold to eventually create the colony on his own account, with support from a number of Western countries, who viewed Leopold as a useful buffer between rival colonial powers. Leopold achieved international recognition for a personal colony, the Congo Free State, in 1885. By the turn of the century, however, the violence of Free State officials against indigenous Congolese and the ruthless system of economic extraction had led to intense diplomatic pressure on Belgium to take official control of the country, which it did in 1908, creating the Belgian Congo. Belgian rule in the Congo was based around the colonial trinity of state, missionary and private company interests. The privileging of Belgian commercial interests meant that large amounts of capital flowed into the Congo and that individual regions became specialized. On many occasions, the interests of the government and private enterprise became closely tied, and the state helped companies break strikes and remove other barriers imposed by the indigenous population. The country was split into nesting, hierarchically organized administrative subdivisions, and run uniformly according to a set, native policy, in contrast to the British and the French, who generally favored the system of indirect rule whereby traditional leaders were retained in positions of authority under colonial oversight. There was also a high degree of racial segregation. Large numbers of white immigrants who moved to the Congo after the end of World War II came from across the social spectrum, but were nonetheless always treated as superior to blacks. During the 1940s and 1950s, the Congo experienced an unprecedented level of urbanization, and the colonial administration began various development programs aimed at making the territory into a model colony. One of the results of the measures was the development of a new middle class of Europeanized African (EVLUS) in the cities. By the 1950s, the Congo had a wage labor force twice as large as that in any other African colony. The Congo's rich natural resources, including uranium, much of the uranium used by the U.S. nuclear program during World War II was Congolese, led to substantial interest in the region from both the Soviet Union and the United States as the Cold War developed. Politics and radicalization. An African nationalist movement developed in the Belgian Congo during the 1950s, primarily among the EVLUS. The movement was divided into a number of parties and groups which were broadly divided on ethnic and geographical lines and opposed to one another. The largest, the Movement National Congolais, was a united front organization dedicated to achieving independence within a reasonable time. It was created around a charter which was signed by, among others, Patrice Lumumba, Cyril Adula and Joseph Ieli Akuto. But others accused the party of being too moderate. Lumumba became a leading figure within the MNC, and by the end of 1959, the party claimed to have 58,000 members. The MNC's main rival was the Alliance des Bas-Congo, led by Joseph Kasavubu, who advocated a more radical ideology than the MNC, based around calls for immediate independence and the promotion of regional identity. ABAKO's stance was more ethnic nationalist than the MNC's. It argued that an independent Congo should be run by the Bas-Congo as inheritors of the pre-colonial Kingdom of the Congo. The Confédération des Associations Tribalistes du Katanga, a localist party led by Moïse Sombe, was the third major organization. It advocated federalism and primarily represented the southern province of Katanga. These were joined by a number of smaller parties which emerged as the nationalist movement developed, including the radical party Solidaire Africaine, and factions representing the interests of minor ethnic groups like the Alliance des Bayenzi. Although it was the largest of the African nationalist parties, the MNC had many different factions within it that took differing stances on a number of issues. It was increasingly polarized between moderate EVLUS and the more radical mass membership. A radical faction headed by Ieli Akuto and Albert Kalonji split away in July 1959, but failed to induce mass defections by other MNC members. The dissident faction became known as the MNC Kalonji, while the majority group became the MNC Lumumba. The split divided the party's support base into those who endured with Lumumba, chiefly in the Stanleyville region in the northeast, and those who backed the MNCK, which became most popular around the southern city of Elizabethville and among the Luba ethnic group. Major riots broke out in Leopoldville, the Congolese capital, on the 4th of January 1959 after a political demonstration turned violent. The force publique, the colonial gendarmerie, used force against the rioters. At least 49 people were killed, and total casualties may have been as high as 500. The Nationalist Party's influence expanded outside the major cities for the first time, and nationalist demonstrations and riots became a regular occurrence over the next year, bringing large numbers of black people from outside the Evalué class into the independence movement. Many blacks began to test the boundaries of the colonial system by refusing to pay taxes or abide by minor colonial regulations. The bulk of the ABAKO leadership was arrested, leaving the MNC in an advantageous position. These developments led to the white community also becoming increasingly radicalized. Some whites planned to attempt a coup d'état if the black majority government took power. As law and order began to break down, white civilians formed militia groups known as Corps de Volontaires Européens to police their neighborhoods. These militias frequently attacked blacks. Independence in the fallout from the Leopoldville riots. The report of a Belgian parliamentary working group on the future of the Congo was published, in which a strong demand for internal autonomy was noted. Auguste de Schrijver, the Minister of the Colonies, launched a high-profile roundtable conference in Brussels in January 1960, with the leaders of all the major Congolese parties in attendance. Lumumba, who had been arrested following riots in Stanleyville, was released in the run-up to the conference and headed the MNCL delegation. The Belgian government had hoped for a period of at least 30 years before independence, but Congolese pressure at the conference led to the 30th of June 1960 being set as the date. Issues including federalism, ethnicity and the future role of Belgium in Congolese affairs were left unresolved after the delegates failed to reach agreement. Belgians began campaigning against Lumumba, whom they wanted to marginalize. They accused him of being a communist and, hoping to fragment the nationalist movement, supported rival, ethnic-based parties like CONAKAT. Many Belgians hoped that an independent Congo would form part of a federation, like the French Community or British Commonwealth of Nations, and that close economic and political association with Belgium would continue. As independence approached, the Belgian government organized Congolese elections in May 1960. These resulted in a broad MNC majority. The proclamation of the Independent Republic of the Congo, and the end of colonial rule, occurred as planned on the 30th of June 1960. In a ceremony at the Palais de la Nation in Leopoldville, King Baudouin gave a speech in which he presented the end of colonial rule in the Congo as the culmination of the Belgian civilizing mission, begun by Leopold II. After the king's address, Lumumba gave an unscheduled speech in which he angrily attacked colonialism and described independence as the crowning success of the nationalist movement. Although Lumumba's address was acclaimed by figures such as Malcolm X, it nearly provoked a diplomatic incident with Belgium. Even some Congolese politicians perceived it as unnecessarily provocative. Nevertheless, independence was celebrated across the Congo. Politically, the new state had semi-presidential constitution, known as the LOI Fondamental, in which executive power was shared between president and prime minister in a system known as bicephalism. Kasavubu was proclaimed president, and Lumumba prime minister, of the Republic of the Congo. Despite the objections of CONAKAT and others, the constitution was largely centralist, concentrating power in the central government in Leopoldville, and did not devolve significant powers to provincial level.